the whole Genesis story, mate, it's got to be fucking aliens. Seriously.
And they got in a little spacecraft and they came here and they landed and they started civilization here.
Seriously.
My being from outer space.
The extraterrestrial races.
That maybe Mars had its own genesis.
We must change the word angel into the word extraterrestrial.
Gotta be fucking aliens.
A super intelligent alien race beamed down a message to all of us Earthlings.
Gotta be fucking aliens. Seriously.
How did we get here? How did we get to the point where spiritual beings and spiritual phenomenon are being conflated with alien beings and technology? What has caused this hyper-externalization of the spiritual world? How did spirituality, something that innately involves the subtle, unseen realms, become a materialist ideology, primarily featuring flesh and blood alien gods and technology as the basis of human creation and evolution? Well, one answer is that our mind and perception have been actually changed over time. Humanity has been sinking deeper and deeper into a materialist perspective. We have progressively become externalists, seeking to understand ourselves and all of creation from the material plane. This externalism and materialism has made many of us literalists, meaning that we are losing our ability to understand metaphor, nuance, and spiritual teachings. The Oxford Dictionary defines literalism as the interpretation of words in their usual or most basic sense. So, literalism is when a person cannot interact with a concept beyond the most basic material interpretation. In our context, it means that when somebody becomes a literalist, that they cannot understand nor interact with the content in a truly initiatory way or a truly meaningful way. They can't actually grasp the deeper meaning of esoteric material. So, in the case of spiritual texts, literalists cannot interact with them in the way in which they were intended. This is because spiritual texts are designed to initiate the reader, not strictly inform the reader about the mundane world. So, while a literalist mindset can get by in the realm of material science quite well, they cannot take that perspective and apply it to spirituality. Though that is exactly what we see happening in many mainstream spiritual movements. Any individual that seeks to enter into spiritual studies must clearly acknowledge that this hyper-materialistic, literalist impulse must be overcome within them. We must actively position ourselves in our studies to recognize the impulse to take things too literally, and we must overcome it. Let's take a deeper look at how humanity has become literalists and what can be done to overcome this impulse. In a lecture entitled Materialism and the Task of Anthroposophy, Rudolf Steiner describes how this force of materialism has affected human consciousness. He reveals that human consciousness evolves over time, and that humanity had reached an intellectual peak in around the mid-1800s. With this development came the impulse of intense materialization, intense materialism, which eventually began to cause a decline of the intellect and overall consciousness of humanity. He says, "It is a fact of great significance that about the middle of the 19th century, the human organism reached a culmination in respect to its physical form, and that since that time it has been regressing. Indeed, in this regard to a rational comprehension of the world, it is regressing rapidly in a certain sense. Already now, a decadence has set in. Further, this perfection of the physical body is connected with the rise of theoretical materialism. Once humanity reaches this high point in physicality and intellect, humanity must begin to rise and learn to attune and open the mind to spiritual forces. This leads to the creation of something called the upper triad, or the three phases of spiritualization known in Anthroposophy as the spirit self, life spirit, and spirit man. These three phases of initiation are the path of spiritualization out of matter for human beings. They are the phases of the spiritualization of our consciousness and form. In the Eastern traditions, these three higher stages of human consciousness are also recognized. In Eastern Esoterica, the spiritual self is called manas, which means mind, or in our case, the spiritualization of the mind, spirit self. It means that our mind becomes harmonized with Christ within, rather than the lower ego. The next level of integration in the Eastern tradition is called Budhi consciousness. In Anthroposophy, this is called life spirit. When an individual reaches this level of development, they have the ability to directly enmesh with higher streams of knowledge and higher spiritual forces. The final level of integration, which will happen to most individuals much later in their incarnations, is called in the Eastern traditions Atman, or spirit man in Anthroposophy. At this point in development, we see the process of the complete spiritualization of the human being. In order to achieve these three phases of spiritualization, humanity must release the negative ego and open themselves to their inner Christ forces. When this is done, these higher conditions of consciousness begin to blossom within us. So, the human being is always moving through different stages of development, and it's important to be aware of that and to understand them. Part of the development process is transforming the impulses that no longer serve us, while adjusting our focus to develop the capacities that do. In our era, the impulse that must be overcome is literalism and materialism. At this point in time, the human consciousness is degenerating with too much of these forces within us after building up over a long period of time. These impulses, when unchecked, do not allow the higher triad of spiritual development to take root in our being. In this way, the forces of materialism compete with our development. Unfortunately, we can also see that the literalist mind has begun to enter the world of modern spirituality. Movements have begun whose sole basis is seemingly to rediscover spirituality and our ancient past through a purely literalist lens. The leaders of this movement attempt to do this by repeatedly going back into holy texts of various different spiritual traditions and reinterpreting them in the most literal, materialist way.
I devoted a lifetime to the study of ancient civilizations, ancient languages, their art, their beliefs, and the knowledge that they had. And the question is, when you study, when you look at all that, is it myth, is it mythology, or did it really happen? I believe it all really happened.
This has to come slowly to the surface. We have to learn by the book of Ezekiel and others that something is completely wrong in the past. We have to learn that heaven was not heaven, it was space. Angels were not angels was extraterrestrial, etc. We have to retranslate the old books and we find the new truths. And one day we will find books of Enoch in the Great Pyramid.
These statements precisely represent the literalist impulse. They even admit that they are doing it. The result of this alien god literalist movement is that a bizarre and inverted caricature of reality begins to form. Spiritual beings or angels that exist in the spiritual plane suddenly become physical, flesh and blood alien beings. Their existence and nature becomes warped and inverted into something completely different. The spiritual intricacies of their connection and history with humanity are destroyed and overshadowed by the intense impulse to force spiritual realities into a material paradigm. Entities from lower planes, or what would traditionally be called demonic entities, are also now labeled as alien beings. This new label, of course, masks the reality of their fallen essence, making them simply neutral beings from another planet or another world. In this case, negative spiritual beings become easier to connect with, as individuals are not aware of their genuine origin. And perhaps the most bizarre tenet in modern spirituality that has been warped by literalism is the loss of the spiritual reality of human creation and development. The process of the materialization of the human being in the image of God over time becomes a story about how alien scientists created human beings in a petri dish as slaves. The examples of the spiritual perversions that literalism creates are endless, because the literalist mind cannot honestly enter into spiritual discussions. All it can do is distort and pervert them. Thus, there is a constant stream of warped and inverted spiritual teachings that have nothing to do with spirituality. They are the incoherent ramblings of the unprepared mind. The mind that is regressing deeper and deeper into materialism rather than opening up to the higher triad of spiritual development. Thus, through this progressive distortion of our genuine history, an entirely new and inverted paradigm reveals itself, something I call the alien God myth or the alien God paradigm, a belief system that, at its height, contains nothing of the spiritual and is the result of complete materialist perversions.
Let's take another great document literally. The Bible says, the church was decorated with frescoes in the middle of the 14th century. Recently, the question has been asked, do the frescoes of Tuscany represent spaceships? Yes, they do look a bit like spaceships. In the first ship, we see a man seated, his hand on a stick shift, He is definitely observing the second spaceship.
Please note the aerodynamic form. Jets are clearly seen.
The spectators are protecting their faces with their hands. They are obviously terrified.
There is no explanation for the origin or purpose of these fantastic pictures.
This fresco in Dasani that is featured in Chariot of the Gods and many later documentaries and books that propagate the alien god ideology is a great example of how literalism destroys our idea of spiritual beings and spiritual processes that are portrayed stylistically in art and literature. While we can all agree that what is being portrayed in this fresco looks unusual and perhaps even a little bit like a spaceship, when we look back at the art of the era, we find that this kind of stylized portrayal of an angel is a popular theme in Byzantium art. The Byzantium era of art is very stylized and very geometric. Faces and torsos of spiritual beings seem to push outward from the sky, giving the effect that they are peering into our plane from another, peering to the earth from the heavens. In this style of art, angels in unusual-looking orbs are quite typical. The halos and spiritual body that radiates from spiritual figures like Jesus also has this staccato geometric appearance. Is this an alien spaceship landing behind Jesus? Is this image a picture of Jesus in a spaceship? Is this an alien? No, this is the artist's way of portraying spiritual forces, such as the radiant astral body of Christ and the arrival of angelic beings, also surrounded by a radiant glow, to show their divine nature and the reality that they're from another plane. Keep in mind that to clairvoyants, angels and spiritual masters often appear surrounded by something that's commonly called a Merkaba, or an energy body. It is also common for an orb of light to appear first when a being is manifesting in the physical plane. So this radiant encasement that has been portrayed for thousands of years in spiritual art is not a UFO. It is simply the energy body surrounding angels and spiritual masters. UFOs have also been pointed out by some within the alien god ideology in this painting of the crucifixion.
Tonight's Fact or Fiction is brought to you by America's Finest Carpet.
In tonight's Fact or Fiction, we are looking into a story getting some buzz today. It shows a fresco of a crucifixion of Jesus painted on a wall in an 11th century cathedral in the country of Georgia. And if you look closely at the top left and right corners, you can see that objects, they appear to be some sort of flying crafts. The ships are dome-like with 3 trails coming out of the bottom, and UFO enthusiasts insist this is proof that flying saucers were present during the death of Jesus. But there is certainly no proof this is the case. Art historians say the objects actually represent guardian angels. Others speculate they represent the sun and the moon. Unfortunately, the artist is unknown and his intent is lost to history.
However, simply looking at a high-res image clearly reveals that these are faces emerging from the sky. The personified sun and moon are watching Christ at his moment of crucifixion. Images of Mary's Annunciation are also used in alien god teachings. The spiritual ray from the heavens containing the Holy Spirit is often said to be a beam from a UFO, and many alien god believers believe that this is evidence that Jesus was actually an alien. Within the alien god religion, there is a concerted effort to reinterpret Christ's identity as an alien being, as an extraterrestrial. As mentioned, this removes our ability to connect with the Christ force within ourselves. An important part of the reality of Christ is that he was a human being, just like us. What made him such an incredible person was his high level of spiritual mastery or spiritual initiation, something that one day we can all perhaps attain. Thus, by removing Christ's humanness and making him an alien, an extraterrestrial, we actually remove our own understanding of spiritual development. The problem with taking spiritual texts literally is obviously that they are not designed to be read that way. Spiritual texts contain metaphors, similes, and symbology to describe non-material beings and non-material events. The reason why symbolic language is used is because it is impossible to describe something literally or as a material thing when it exists in another plane and does not ascribe to material laws. Thus, the only way to portray the truly spiritual is through symbol and metaphor. Thus, while spiritual texts may contain some information that can be taken historically or literally, spiritual texts are, by nature, designed to evoke the higher mind and spiritual bodies. Because they describe spiritual phenomenon or phenomenon that transcends the material plane, they must be treated as texts that evoke transcendental experiences. They cannot be seen as literalist documents. So, spiritual documents and myths have a different function that actually transcends the mundane world. It transcends our mundane, materialist, literalist mind entirely. In fact, in order for spiritual material to remain transcendent and serve its purpose, it must be understood that it should not be taken literally. To take Genesis, or the events of the Enuma Elish, or other spiritual creation myths too literally, is to destroy them in our own mind. It is to make them utterly useless. This is not to say that there is not mundane information in such ancient documents. There is. A good example of this is that the Sumerians recorded how much grain they have stored or how much wine they have produced. They also recorded the position of the planets and stars. In fact, in most holy books, there are certain passages that describe daily life, historical events, or more mundane aspects of the culture to give context. However, the reality that our ancestors included these pieces of history and mundane life in spiritual writings does not mean that the overall nature of the writing is mundane, or that its entire content should be taken literally. As mentioned, spiritual writing is designed to evoke certain feelings and memories within our consciousness. It is designed to initiate. This means that when we read these words or see certain symbols, a higher aspect of our mind is being engaged with, or our spiritual self is being engaged with. This higher part of our being needs to be stimulated in order to fully awaken. Spiritual texts, including creation myths, are not designed to be viewed literally. They are therefore designed to evoke spiritual memory and evoke spiritual forces within our being. This is the reason why in all traditional schools of initiation, within all spiritual traditions, no matter the culture, use symbolism to awaken and attune our spiritual mind. For example, archetypal movements or temple dances are not just physical movements. They are used to stimulate and unlock spiritual knowledge that lies within our body. I believe it was Gurdjieff who famously said that each movement of a temple dance was like reading a page of a book. Rudolf Steiner's eurythmy is also a deeply awakening practice designed to harmonize our consciousness with initiating forces. So within these sacred movements is a deeper meaning that is working upon us. Their effect is completely bypassing the material mind. These movements are designed to do that. To only pay attention to the physical aspect of the dance would be to cut oneself off from the actual purpose of the movement. While temple dances are clearly physical movement, the entire point is to transcend physicality, to transcend the surface level of our being, and dive deeply into our inner spiritual world. Sounds and music also have a spiritual element that transcends their material expression. There are ceremonial rhythms that, like temple dances, are designed to attune one's consciousness to subconscious memories of our ancient past. When we align our consciousness with our soul's past, we feel a sense of wholeness, and we begin to recognize larger patterns in society and our own personal lives that are repeating. There are also certain tones that can stimulate and awaken spiritual organs.
Aum, Aum, Ra, Ma, Aum, Aum.
And there are also mantras, which are the repetition of certain words or phrases.
This mantra from the Upanishad is death instructing the student on the nature of self.
Sarve vedayat padamamananti tapamsi sarvani cha yadvadanti yadichanto brahmacharyam charanti tatte padam sangrahena bravimyo mityetat.
Obviously, mantras are not about the word as much as they are about the effect that the word produces within the consciousness of the individual. Symbols are also direct doorways into our subconscious and spiritual minds. Symbols can take the form of actual images, or they can take the form of metaphorical myths in the case of spiritual texts. When we encounter a symbol in a spiritual text, the point is to evoke certain forces within the individual, to bring them to the surface. To take a symbol or metaphor literally is to completely lose the plot. It is to completely abandon the purpose of the text to begin with. In fact, the literalist mind has great difficulty with spiritual material because the literalist always feels as though the secrets within the documents are hidden from them. There is an innate desire and perhaps memory of spiritual perception, but their mind continually pushes them into a more literal interpretation. It seems the secrets are always just behind the veil. Keep in mind that we all struggle with this impulse to literalize spiritual material, and that we must all work to overcome it. Even more mainstreams, like that of Jungian psychology, acknowledge that the depths of the human mind works almost exclusively through symbolism and metaphor. Our lower mind, or literalist mind, often doesn't realize that this higher process of spiritual symbolic language is even occurring. Thus, our lower materialist mind can work against our own healing and spiritual awakening. Our materialist mind can work against us. It is only when this lower mind can become conscious of the higher spiritual mind that harmony begins within the human psyche. We must train ourselves through meditation, shadow work, and spiritual study to overcome the polarization of the higher and lower minds, to overcome the increasing polarization of the spiritual self and the physical self. If we are not careful, the lower ego will attempt to separate from the spiritual world and destroy itself. Through the use of symbol and metaphor, certain feelings and even memories may emerge within our perception. We don't often consciously understand why we are moved by certain stories or images, yet something very deep is moving within us. Spiritual forces are at play, and our lower mind is only able to see a very small part of what is occurring within our higher spiritual self. The symbol, the metaphor, is the key, the gate between the spiritual world and the physical. Symbols, and especially metaphorical stories like myths, connect us not only with our higher self, but also the collective consciousness, which is a subtle world that is just beyond the physical. When symbols are used in stories or myths, they can have a powerful awakening effect on our consciousness. For example, the hare and the maiden is an important symbol in the feminine mysteries. The goddess Ostara, the feminine aspect of the Easter tradition, is seen with her hair in a basket of eggs. The hare is a feminine initiatory symbol, and the eggs symbolize the world egg and the primal role of the mother. Ostara and her hare today have been reduced to the Easter bunny laying eggs. Thanks to individuals who understand this symbology and created myths around it, the deeper meaning endures. We see Alice with her hair fall down the rabbit hole into a backwards fantasy world. This, of course, is also the story of the descent of the Great Mother, the descent of Venus, or also Inanna. She is also known archetypally as Mother Mary in Christian Esoterica, Isis in the Egyptian mysteries, and Persephone in the Greek. Like Ostara, Persephone is a goddess of springtime. This myth allows the feminine consciousness to connect with its innately intuitive nature, and also to understand certain events in the Earth's history and within the feminine experience overall. While we may not fully grasp the symbology in these myths, our higher mind does, and our basic awareness of them opens us to deeper synchronicities and realizations. So, the most important thing about myths is not the dynamics of the story or the literal interpretation of them as some kind of historical event. The most important aspect is that they work upon our higher mind to allow higher knowledge to flow in and initiate our lower mind. We are quietly raised by myths. We are initiated by symbols. Symbols are, in fact, so powerful that they are often inverted in popular culture to have a negative or degrading effect on our subconscious mind. This is the key principle in black magic, and individuals who seek to dominate others can use symbology in an attempt to harvest energy and exact a negative influence. This is why becoming spiritually conscious is so important. If someone sees everything as literal, then they will not have power over their own mind and experience. When it comes to truly initiating spiritual material, there is also a more direct use of symbol and metaphor. This more direct use of symbolism and metaphor occurs when certain conditions are described that no longer exist. Because the current conditions of the earth and humanity are very different than our ancient past, the only way to describe them is through similes, symbols, and metaphors. For example, the Polarian and Hyperborean epochs were non-physical eras of our development. The human being and the planet existed, but were in an entirely different form. We existed in the astral and etheric condition. It would not be correct to say that we didn't exist simply because we had not yet materialized into our current condition. Yet, this is exactly what the materialist mind will insist. The materialist mind will not automatically be able to grasp astral and etheric developments of humanity or the earth. This is a problem because the entire developmental stream must be acknowledged and accounted for if we are to honestly understand ourselves. Humanity and planet must be seen from our most ephemeral, astral beginnings to our most material embodiment. To bridge the differences between the different stages of our existence, metaphors and symbology must be used. In this case, metaphors are not so much to evoke a certain state of being, but rather an attempt to describe a condition or a process that is no longer happening or that was existing only in prior conditions of the earth. The symbol or metaphor in this case is used to directly preserve the knowledge of these lost eras of mankind, these earlier epochs of development that were not fully materialized or in the same paradigm that we are today. In this line of thought, another element we must understand when taking in ancient texts is that human consciousness operated differently thousands and even hundreds of years ago. Human beings originally related spiritual information through stories. Myths were designed not to entertain as we see today, but rather to spiritually initiate and preserve wisdom. So, our ancestors did not really record the events of the ancient past literally. They weren't really prioritizing telling actual accounts. Our mind was not operating that way. Our conscious was not yet capable of doing that. Instead, we preserved certain spiritual events and concepts in symbolic stories. To convey these spiritual events, laws, and beings, seemingly outrageous characters and circumstances were portrayed, such as the world turtle, or the great mother spider who weaves the heavens and creates mankind. Now, the Ojibwe people and the Hopi people are not saying that an actual spider lady gave birth to humanity and the cosmos, but rather we're using the spider and the feminine and its web as a symbol or metaphor for the divine feminine's all-encompassing creative essence. This same feminine creative force is portrayed in Egyptian mysteries as Nut and Hathor and is known to the Gnostics as Sophia, the great mother in the cosmos. This idea of the divine feminine as the weaver is also portrayed in Christianity, where Mother Mary is often pictured with a spindle or loom, clearly weaving her threads into the higher planes. The divine feminine as the weaver is also portrayed in the classic children's myth, Sleeping Beauty. This relation of the weaving etheric spider and the feminine would have been obvious to our ancestors. Our minds in those earlier times were beautifully intuitive and poetic. We naturally spoke in archetypes and understood the natural and spiritual worlds. And the connection between certain animals, the earth, and the world of spirit were very, obvious to us. As mentioned, our mind has become more and more materially oriented, more literalist, more separated. And it's no longer automatically capable of entering into such myths without preparation. Now that we understand these important truths about our state of consciousness and its potential difficulty when it comes to engaging with innately transcendental material, we can see that going back into ancient texts such as the Sumerian creation myth or the biblical creation myth with a literalist perspective is not going to produce a revelation. If spiritual material is entered into with a literalist mind, it will simply pervert, invert, and destroy the teaching. In fact, human consciousness is becoming less and less capable of actually understanding spiritual material, as spiritual texts were written when humanity was in a different kind of consciousness. Formative events from prior epochs are impossible to grasp without properly preparing our mind. This means that to understand ourselves and our past, we must develop the higher triad, or our spiritual mind. With this development, with the spiritualization of our mind and ourself, we will begin to not only raise our consciousness, but also remember who we are and actively engage with who we are becoming. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you enjoy my work, please consider supporting me on my website at gigiyoung.com. You can become a patron or member and enjoy an incredible community of spiritual seekers and enjoy exclusive live Q&As. I do 2 live Q&As every month where I take your questions. Or, to keep this information alive, you can make a donation. Also, be sure to sign up for my newsletter and, of course, share this video. Thank you.